Have you ever asked for help and not gotten it? Or has someone ever asked you for help and you not helped them? How did that feel? The stranger in your gates. Therefore, love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. This lesson is interesting because it's touching on the last lesson and bringing this lesson to talk about basically what Jesus said, where the first one is talking about loving the Lord your God with all your heart, might, and strength, right? And then loving your neighbor as yourself. So it's basically those two commandments that Jesus was talking about, representing the division where the first four are for loving God and 6, right? The last 6 are for others and yourself, to show how we should treat others and how we should treat God. All of that. And this lesson is touching on neighbors and how to treat strangers. It's very fascinating because changing all of that idea of love, right? And putting it now in this lesson for people around you. It kind of feels a little tough because as I was reading it, there were a lot of things that made me kind of realize that I wasn't doing exactly what I thought I was doing. This lesson basically starts with how we're loving God and how we should love ourselves, but then it goes into this idea of like circumcision, where circumcision was basically the outward way of this covenant where we're like, yes, we are following God, we are God's people. And here it's saying that there's an internal of the heart, right? Circumcision of the heart, where it's more that internal thing. Because in a way, Israel, a lot of times, they would be doing things on the outside as if it seemed like they were following God, but on the inside, it was for the wrong reasons. And here is how we set the stage for this lesson, where it's basically talking about people and how they are going through all these things, and how here Moses is reminding them that you guys, Israel, were in Egypt as slaves and once were strangers in a strange land, right? To remind them. But here's what's interesting. When Jesus was talking about those commandments, those 2 commandments, Israel, they were not living in this way. In fact, the rest of other nations didn't like Israel because they had kind of cocooned themselves and just followed so rigidly these rules, these laws, that it wasn't attainable to others outside of the Jewish nation. And so here we actually see this promise when Jesus is talking about it not being fulfilled. And so there are these 2 dynamics, right, where it's almost like seeing a sad ending before it comes, and you want to tell them, no, don't do this, because they're going to go to this wrong path, because now they lose sight of how they should be treating strangers. And in fact, they uplift themselves and see themselves as better. And they say, oh, I don't want to be to those people. Even like with the Good Samaritan, all those stories describing how Israel valued themselves and did not value others in any degree. And they had lost sight of what is being told here. And the lesson goes over many things, saying on Tuesday that you were strangers before, and describing how for each lesson, how it should be internal, how basically with Egypt it's supposed to reflect in the laws that God created for Israel to follow to make sure that it cared for these strangers, right? And how that would help them judge them in a righteous way, how it would help them be more true to what God was doing to us, and to make sure that they were imparting that and representing God. But it's not really happening. It's not this religion, this faith that happens. So now I want to turn it back, because as we read this and as I read this, it's very easy to say, wow, that's crazy. How could they do this? How could these people act this way? But look at us for a second and say, okay, how could we be doing this? How could we be acting in a way that we should not be? Because we are most likely, in fact, probably worse in a lot of ways, doing exactly what we look at Israel and are shocked by. As Christians who follow God, how should we be acting? Because with the time of COVID and with social media being on the forefront, things have changed. As Christians, we are not representing God. We are actually creating this separation from people because in a lot of ways, we're looking to the general public and not wanting to understand them, not wanting to present things in a way that makes sense. We're actually pushing them away even further by thinking that we're witnessing to them. And because of this whole new way of thinking with social media, and now even with COVID, right, where we've got to protect ourselves, we've got to have our rights or do things, and we're forgetting in a lot of ways by trying to follow our path, we're pushing people aside and running through and trying to trample over them because we don't have time for those people. They're probably already lost. We're not saying that outwardly, but we're acting that way. We're doing things that isn't godly. When I went to Rwanda a few years back, there was this feeling of, it was sad to see the life that a lot of those people lived. It was total poverty. They had nothing. And when we were leaving, we had this thought of leaving our clothes for them because just the material of our clothes were so much better than the scraps that they could find, that even our scraps were considered amazing. And I left my clothes behind as well, but I had this feeling of like, oh, I don't want to give them my best. And that's interesting. That for me, because I thought, oh, they won't know the difference, or whatever it was, I had this feeling where I didn't want to do something that would have made a world of difference for them. And for me, oh no, but I still can get more use out of this, and I wanted to give my scraps. And that's what I noticed is difficult, because for us, whenever we're in a situation like that, it's very easy when we're on the good side of things to say, oh, who cares? I mean, we did our part. The rest doesn't matter. But when we are on that other side, how does it feel? It's interesting to see how throughout history these moments happened, right? And you can see both sides doing crazy things, like in World War II, how with the Nazis basically taking over Europe, the amount of destruction, emotional destruction, how they treated people, how they treated the Jewish population, and how a lot of people stood up, right? There's one person that I was very fascinated by. I don't know how to say his name, but Johann von Holst, I think is his name, where he saved 600 children by smuggling them out as if they were food in baskets and sacks of food, right? How this person, 600 children, he didn't have to do that, but how does it change people, right? When you see the strangers around you suffering, what do you do? And this is what God is talking about. This is what we can't grasp, because in a lot of ways, we might either be living in a country of wealth or in a country that might not have wealth, but even then we see other people beneath us, because the lesson talks about wealth quite a bit and shows how there is this side of riches and how even Israel didn't escape it, where they weren't really helping the poor but kind of were. And it shows that like that hierarchy, that difference, it kind of does blind us to this. And here God is trying to remind us. It's the hardest thing for me still to this day to think. I've been to so many countries, lived in so many poor countries, been poor myself, and I still have a hard time looking back or looking to someone else and wanting to help them. And that is what I do for a living. And that's tough. So I want to have that as a reminder for you guys. Because if you look at the same thing on my end and looking at this lesson, it's so easy to ignore when it's not you. But it makes a world of difference when it is you. Look at this last quote from Friday. It's hard to imagine how even in the best of times, such as under David and Solomon, the people of Israel could have been so blessed by God and yet could have so oppressed the poor, the helpless, and the outcasts among them. There's more to the quote, but I wanted to leave you with this thought, that even during the greatest times, there were these complications, these problems, the mighty heroes, the people that we look at in the Bible, there were still problems. And we can make that difference the way God is showing us, the way Jesus showed us, that we can impact people's lives, the way we treat them, the way we deal with them, because we were once strangers. Christians have suffered in the past, and we will suffer more. Everyone is going to suffer more. How are we going to help everyone? And how are you going to make a difference in someone's life?